Chapter 5 The Flight. I turned towards the region where my Tibetan hermit friend lived, whose brother had procured me Tibetan clothes south of the Gobi Desert. I felt that the ruler of the holy city would not feel safe while I lived, and as it is quite impossible for him to have me murdered openly, be it only out of consideration for Narbu, whose eyes might have been opened by such an occurrence, he would no doubt try to kill me by powerful magical operations. Even attacks of this kind become more difficult when the distance separating the magician from his enemy increases, and as I had no desire to fight these currents more than was absolutely necessary, I intended to set out at the rate of about 30 miles a day and take a rest upon my arrival in the abode of the wise hermits. It was late in the evening, and as soon as night had fallen, I put up my tent at a place about 8 miles distant from the underground city. I naturally chose a place where I was hidden by small ridges. I knew that the magical attacks I had to expect would in all probability be brought to bear during the night, about 12 to 1 being the worst hours, and that so long as I remained awake, and from families living in the district, and instead of cutting them up, they had devised some trick to steal the dead bodies and smuggle them into the city under the cover of night. The people coming from the city had arrived. I recognized them by their resplendent black robes. They were masters in the occult brotherhood. They knelt down near the lifeless bodies, and then magical operations were started to resuscitate them. I am sorry I must withhold a few details relative to these practices, for some of the operations were so disgusting that I must abstain from giving a description, be it even in Latin. After strenuous work, greatly varying in duration, three of the lifeless bodies had begun to move and walk on towards the city mechanically, like so many robots led on by one of the masters. Were the lifeless bodies really dead before the resuscitation practices were started? If so, it was dreadful to imagine what kind of servants had cleaned my room and prepared the food in the holy city. Five other lifeless bodies, where the resuscitation practices had failed to take effect, were carried on towards the holy city. Being of a practical disposition, the exalted jewel possibly did not wish to lose a single lifeless body he had obtained by trickery or by bribery. Those who were past hope may have been sent to the kitchen, and their bones to the temple. Dreadful. As soon as the procession preceded by the walking robots led by the masters had disappeared from sight, I approached to ascertain whether the stretchers and numerous footsteps had left some traces on the ground. The experience had been so unusual that I wished to check up whether I could believe the evidence of my senses. After inspecting the footprints very thoroughly, I marched on. Why on earth did these people perform those dreadful ceremonies in broad daylight? They had a whole underground city where they could do all they liked, surrounded as they were by walking automatons who could never betray them. And even if such ceremonies could not be performed underground for some reason or other, why did they perform them in broad daylight? True, the chances of meeting someone in that forlorn part of the city were exceedingly small, but small as they were, why did they run that risk at all? Thinking further along these lines while I walked on, I came to the conclusion that if such clever rogues took any chance at all, they must have had an imperative reason for doing so. The waking up ceremonies were performed in the light of the sun that had just risen. This seemed to indicate that the cosmical currents they needed for their dreadful purpose reached their greatest intensity soon after sunrise. Sunrise and noon are the hours of God, sunset and midnight the hours of darkness. The devils stole cosmic forces from the Creator then to accomplish their own horrible work. As usual, the evil one is strongest when he snatches away the forces of the Creator and uses divine forces to his own end. Of course, all of these speculations were based on the assumption that the Lagpas had really escorted dead bodies, corpse cutters, I walked on at a top speed and once more reviewed the happenings of the last 3 days. Why had I been saved? I had come to the city on the invitation and recommendation of Narbu, who was himself misled and failed to realize the real nature of the Brotherhood. I had entered the city in a disinterested spirit to help, and not in order to get something. My lion temperament had revolted when they proposed to hang round me the black ceremonial robes, which were in all probability magnetized too. All their subtle magic, mesmerized food, and maybe even other tricks I knew nothing about, had failed to produce the occult results they desired, because throughout my stay in the city I had never sinned, be it even in thoughts. The evil one can only take those who give themselves voluntarily up to him, and where he oversteps that limit there are angels of the Creator who protect the innocent. They had tried to snatch my soul away. I love my soul, through which the Creator speaks to me through my heart. The harder they worked to snatch it away, the more desperately I clung to it. Great fires, like other turmoils in life, may destroy the weak, but they purify the strong and make him still stronger. More and more I began to be aware of the fact that life, including life on spiritual planes, was not an affair of peaceful contemplation and quiet worship, but a dreadful turmoil, a grim fight, and a bitter struggle. Had I met this procession 3 days earlier, carrying lifeless bodies on stretchers, it might have opened my eyes at once. I might have immediately realized the real nature of the Brotherhood, and thus missed the greatest experience of my life. The following 2 days were marked by all sorts of minor and greater troubles. I was attacked by whole swarms of gnats, and during the night while I lay on the ground wide awake, I have stated earlier why I had to sacrifice sleep. I heard a succession of queer noises in the darkness. There was a scamper and a continual coming and going resembling the sound you hear in a warehouse infested by thousands of large rats. In the morning I found that practically all my food had been eaten during the night, and even my equipment damaged by bites such as could only be attributed to rats of unusual size. The subsequent nights I had the dreadful experience with murderous parasites which I have described in my earlier book. I might have bled to death had I not noticed the creatures in time. This was the third night since I had left the city, and for the first time since leaving it I had a little sleep, but every time I passed from a state of full consciousness into the state of half consciousness, which usually precedes sleep, I felt as if I lay in a coffin. So I made an effort again and again to return to full consciousness and to keep wide awake until daybreak. Once more I had plenty of time to think over the dreadful practices and strange resuscitation rites of the soul snatchers in the city of the initiates. What was the fundamental difference between the members of the Brotherhood who had given or were on the way to give their souls to the evil one, on the one hand, and those lifeless servants on the other? If man really was complex, what did he consist of? I, of course, realized the danger of contemplations of that sort. Consciousness, which should be totalitarian in man, has a tendency to split up, which is a very real danger. By indulging too much in speculations of this sort, man provides a point d'appui, the Shiva principle of the Hindus. By the way, Akbi means to die in Tibetan, and Shi means dead. For the great spiritual forces forming parts of the downward current of life which serve the purpose of disintegration. The physical nature of man is fivefold, I thought. There are 5 organic systems in our bodies to which all organic functions of the body can be related. Man has 5 senses. He has 5 fingers on each hand and 5 toes on each foot. 5 seems to be the number of the creature and of man in particular. But even if we look beyond the physical aspect of man, his nature seems to be fivefold. Man is a unit composed of purely physical characteristics: sensation, feeling, intelligence, and will. So why should he not be composed of 5 different vehicles welded into one unit which man does very well not to try to disassociate under any circumstances. I thought of the dreadful crime against himself and the soul committed by the Sung-mi and the Tibetan monastery. See Chapter 2 of this book and the Tibetan seances when people voluntarily relinquish control over all the vehicles that rightfully belong to them, thus throwing themselves open to all sorts of disembodied entities, just like a man who might throw open his doors and windows during the night in a house built in a jungle. The difference between the members of the Brotherhood and the wifeless servants resuscitated by magical practices was the following, I thought. The brothers had given their souls to the evil one. They were men composed of a body, sensation, feeling, and intelligence. Only their will was no longer their own. They had given up their most divine attribute, their free will, to the evil one. The servants, on the other hand, I thought were mere robots. When they had died, their subtler vehicles had left their corpses immediately after death, and only their dense body remained. Their vitalizing principle, which is the seat of sensation floating about near the corpse. Then the body was stolen, and the vitalizing principle made to re-enter it. The servants then were mere agglomerates of a body plus a vehicle of sensation. That is to say, mere robots possessing a body and sensation, but devoid of feeling, intelligence, and will. My whole experience in the city confirmed this opinion. The servants had no intelligence at all. They mechanically repeated certain formulae. They were absolutely devoid of the capacity to think independently and to have emotions. They were body plus sensation and nothing else. In a sense, they were ideal servants. Dreadful as this body snatching practice was, it seemed to be infinitely less tragic than the soul snatching business going on in the holy city. For the souls of the men who had inhabited the bodies of the servants were not affected by the fact that their dead bodies had been stolen by the lieutenants of the prince. Daybreak had come, and I rose to march on. I had another strenuous and unpleasant day. By coincidence, I lost my whole water supply early in the morning. There was no thunderstorm all day. The afternoon was hotter than usual, and I suffered greatly from thirst. With parched lips, I lay down in the afternoon and fell asleep. It was nearly nightfall when I awoke. I felt marvelously refreshed. I felt glad, since I had a better chance to keep awake during the time when those confounded magical practices started, soon after midnight. The following day I visited one of the monasteries I have mentioned in my earlier book, and again, by coincidence, I had one of my worst experiences. I was nearly found out by the lamas and had to face the ordeal of sitting about motionless for many hours until I could make my escape. Another monastery was visited 2 days later. As is customary in Tibetan monasteries, I was offered holy water to drink. It was impossible to refuse, as all the other pilgrims seemed to be very keen on drinking the holy water, which was offered by a kind of burgher. These burghers, by the way, get the lion's share of the coins collected from pious pilgrims in Tibetan monasteries. I know that the Utpalamdag castor oil plant is known at least in southern Tibet, but I do not suspect the burghers to be so ingenious as to add castor oil to the holy water in order to make some money afterwards by providing certain facilities. Had I refused, I might have attracted much unwelcome attention. An hour later, the holy water produced a very unwelcome reaction as far as my physical well-being was concerned, and since the sanitary arrangements in the monastery did not provide the necessary degree of privacy which a Westerner expects as his natural right on certain occasions, an unusual amount of skill and dexterity and all my resourcefulness was required to wriggle out of the difficulty, since I was in the disguise of a Tibetan and had dyed my face and hands only since my supply of color was exceedingly limited. I then spent a few hours quietly walking about in the monastery. As I was deaf and dumb, in order to hide my foreign accent, I also enjoyed the priceless advantage of not being pestered by the many guides who prey on pilgrims in Tibetan monasteries. no matter how poor they may be, as they seem to know by experience, that the religious poor are always only glad to let go of their last farthing for religious purposes. I thought how wise Western tourists would be if they adopted the clever practice of posing as deaf and dumb persons when visiting certain guide-infested tourist centers. I had a good look at the Tibetan butter idols. There were idols in the monastery entirely composed of butter mixed with colored earth. They, of course, stood in the shadow. Since the afternoons in the summer were dreadfully warm, I had to smile once more when thinking of the fact that idols fight shy of sunshine, since the latter had a tendency to melt them. Was it not symbolical, I thought, that idols could only exert their influence in the shadow and not in bright sunshine? Elaborate ceremonies were performed by the lamas. An abundant supply of human bones have been used for making censers and other objects used for divine service. I thought of the holy city. The same spirit seemed to reign in the monastery, although in a greatly diluted manner. The lamas distributed pills made of rice to the pilgrims after having consecrated them by elaborate rites. I thought of the temple in the city. The lamas also spoke of the necessity to believe blindly in the content of their 333 holy books. The holy books of dogmatic Buddhism consist of the 108 volumes of the Kanjur and the 225 volumes of the Tanjur, making a total of 333 volumes. In occult numerology, philosophy of abstract figures, the total of the various figures composing a number plays an important part. If we examine the above three numbers, we find that the sum of the figures composing the numbers 108, 225, and 333 is 9 in each case. The reader will recall that I mentioned earlier in the book that the city of the initiates had the number 9 considered an especially auspicious number. Just like the members of the Brotherhood in the city, I thought. There, too, the most sublime gift of man, his intelligence, had to be discarded and transcended. They continually spoke, too, of salvation, of saving one's soul by giving it up to the divine. Many, perhaps most of the conversations at which I had been present in the city, in the dining buildings, and elsewhere, had a distinct parallel in the sermons of the lamas. The prince catered for the elect, the lamas for the multitude, I thought, but I failed to see any fundamental difference between the two. And God's sun shone over the monastery. I thought of the dreadful tragedy of a world in open revolt against its creator. I spent a few hours studying the mechanism of meditation, which I have described in an earlier book, and then left the monastery with much sadness in my heart. Were not nearly all of these poor people in the same position as Narbu? They wanted to be saved and tried to save others. And while they were looking for salvation, their poor beings disintegrated more and more. Their soul consciousness decreased. Oh, the dreadful tragedy of being unable to help them. Trouble followed trouble. It was as if some mysterious hand was putting obstacles in my way. The following morning I met with a gang of brigands. I saw them too late, and when they searched my belongings, they confiscated one of the things I needed most, a thin blanket made of fine wool. None of the many brigands I had met earlier had had the heart to take the blanket away from me, who to all appearances was a poor lonely traveler. But these brigands were tougher and much less considerate. I had a faint idea that they were really lamas and carried on the brigand profession as a sideline. On another occasion I had recognized a robber in the robe of a lama when visiting a monastery after having been robbed. The Tibetans hold the lamas in high esteem and do not even dare to look at them, which must greatly facilitate this double profession. I wonder whether the 108 holy books of the Kanjur contain a passage reading, "Your left hand should ignore what your right hand is doing." This is the first part of the Tibetan Bible, so to speak. If it does, the lamas may have no difficulty in absolving themselves from the sin of robbery. I spent one of my worst nights. I had no blanket, and the temperature in the small hours was not much higher than about 18 degrees Fahrenheit. As if by another coincidence, the coldest night in many weeks had come on just after my blanket had been confiscated. The cold of such Tibetan nights strikingly contrasts with the generous sunshine and hot weather usually reigning on cloudless summer afternoons. Although I know how to protect myself from cold by keeping my muscles and chest entirely relaxed, there are limits to physical endurance. Lying motionless for hours in an unheated tent at about 18 degrees Fahrenheit when one has no blanket is more than anyone can bear. From time to time I galloped round outside the tent in wide circles, and then lay crumpled up within like a child in the womb of its mother. I had not a wink of sleep all that night. Then the sun rose, and all was bright again. Is there anything that symbolizes the Creator better than the sun, which generously gives warmth and life to all those who do not keep out its radiancy by their own free will? The sun is generous and majestic, and yet keeps his distance from those for whom he shines. He who looks full into the sun may be struck with blindness. The same applies to the creature who wants to fathom the Creator. If you wish to be too much like him, if you wish to reach out into the domain beyond the reach of the creature, you strike yourself with spiritual blindness and mistake the moon for the sun. I walked on as fast as I could. I had no blanket, and a few dreadfully cold nights were before me. I was only about 150 miles from the abode of the wise hermit whose brother I had met south of the Gobi Desert. I had asked the latter whether great spiritual teachers lived on the way so that I might visit them when passing the respective districts. He had not mentioned the city of which I had learned only through my acquaintance with Dolma and Narbu, but had talked about a great spiritual teacher to whom I might listen. He lived on a high mountain, which I would pass a few days before reaching the district where several hermits, including his brother, lived. Does he serve light or darkness? I had asked him. I cannot tell you that, he had replied. You must discover it yourself. Is it not your spiritual duty to warn me of the demons who may easily appear in the disguise of angels, as occasionally happens in Western countries? I had asked further. No, he had said. Even if I realize their nature myself, it is a man's highest spiritual duty to respect another man's spiritual freedom. By cataloging spiritual teachers and telling you who is the evil one and who is not, I should influence your spiritual attitude. You must discover things for yourself. You are going to Tibet. You have to take a risk, not I. His answer had been very firm. I walked all morning and then slept during many hours in the afternoon. I awoke feeling a very strange kind of pain in the region of the heart. I examined myself medically in a thorough manner, even devising an emergency stethoscope for the occasion, but found that there was absolutely nothing wrong with me, and I think no specialist had been present could have discovered anything either. Yet the pain was rather violent, as though an invisible hand was directing piercing stabs against my heart. So it was either a case of autosuggestion, I wish to God it was, or the work of those confounded sorcerers in the city. I knew that magical processes of this kind lose the largest part of their vigor after 5 days, and eagerly anticipated the time when 5 clear days would have lapsed since I had left the holy city. Evening came, and I greatly regretted the impossibility of walking on in the darkness, since the countryside became more and more mountainous. After another dreadfully cold night spent in an unheated tent without a blanket, at a temperature that was many degrees under freezing point, I felt so tired that I fell asleep soon after sunrise. Late in the afternoon, I again started at top speed, and after having consulted the sketch drawn by the hermits, I knew that only a few miles separated me from the mountain on which the great spiritual teacher lived. My hermit friend had told me that he refused to bear any title, that he lived very simply without making any effort at being simple. Simplicity in itself may be a pose, The author has occasionally found humble people to be even more irritating than strutting and blustering folk. That he had no special circle of disciples or followers, and that he always stressed the necessity that people should follow the lights of their own intelligence and not allow themselves to be influenced by anyone else. In short, he seemed to be the very reverse of the prince in the city, and needless to say, I was rather inclined to consider him as a sincere teacher, although I reserved my opinion until I had actually met him and his followers. He was known by the name of Gentle Friend, and according to what my hermit friend had told me before I entered Tibet, many Tibetans interested in Dol Shug principles, a teaching which recommends the elimination of all passion in life and the cool judging of things in an impersonal way, were amongst his regular visitors. About 500 yards before I reached his abode, the gentle friend, as I had been told, never traveled and was always at home. I met a nice young Tibetan and asked him whether he knew where the Stunt Pat Shimpo, great teacher, lived. Lags, Lags, he answered. His Kampa house is over there. About 20 people live with him at present, some of them in the Kanpa and others in fogs, a kind of den, close by. Who has asked you to come here? No one in particular, I answered, but a friend of mine who lives south of the Gobi Desert mentioned to me his teachings, and I am interested in it. I at once knew by your accent, he observed, that you come from very far, and probably from a remote part in the north. You are right, I said. We had arrived at the house, and I had asked to see the gentle friend. I was told that the teacher had nothing special to say to visitors, but if I was interested in his teaching, there was no objection to me listening to a few of his lectures. The teacher was for everyone and not for private persons. No one stood near to the gentle friend and anyone in the multitude, and that is why he did not receive visitors. If I wanted to come next morning, I should be welcome. I could live in any of the unoccupied dens I liked to choose, and if I had not food and fuel enough, I could get some barley meal and dried yak dung in the house. Decidedly, I began to like the place. Everything seemed to be so simple, matter of fact, and unobtrusive. It seemed to be the very opposite of that dreadful city. The following morning, I met some of the guests who lived in the other dens. It was a rather motley crowd belonging to various walks of life. There were even a few tradesmen who had come a long way from an important trading center to stay on the Mountain of Simplicity. The guests were all deeply interested in religious matters, and most of them seemed to be possessed of an unusual amount of intelligence. However, they were not much cleaner than other Tibetans in similar conditions. "Where is your Kisa native place?" was one of the first questions. The young man I had met the day before told them all he knew about me. He said that I was a truth seeker, and my attention had been called to the Mountain of Simplicity by a Drogban, living south of the deserts, a good friend. This remark created quite a sensation, since only a few people had ever visited the mountain who came from so enormously distant a place. Some people observed that there was a very queer smell about me. I had noticed it myself. It was as if I carried dead mice in my pocket, but I could not help it. The little crowd was keenly interested in abstract problems. While we were walking up to the Kanpa for the lecture, they discussed the problems of good and evil, light and shadow, with great animation. For them it seemed good and evil did not exist at all. There was no such thing as bad, one of them observed, and all the others agreed to it. Everything was a mere reflection of ourselves. I inwardly disagreed. I thought of the dreadful city I had left a few days before. I knew for a fact that such a thing as evil in itself existed. No amount of philosophy could discuss the devil away and the obvious polarity of nature. We entered the house of simplicity. It was none too clean. We sat down on mattresses. Soon afterwards, the room filled up with other people, and when about 20 to 25 had gathered for the lecture, The outer door was closed and bolted, and the gentle friend, whom everyone seemed to regard as a great spiritual teacher, entered. I compared him with the spiritual head of the city. He seemed to be the very opposite in appearance, whereas the prince or exalted jewel had been the very picture of majesty. This man seemed to be a picture of humility. He was unostentatiously dressed in a cheap and almost shabby chupa. His face was kind and gentle, and looked the very embodiment of renouncement, unselfishness, and happiness. He was rather old, and his body perhaps a trifle too stout, his appointments in all probability being due to lack of exercise. As I said before, he never traveled. I had so many spiritual surprises in my life. I have just had the greatest in the city that I entirely reserved my opinion of him until I had heard him lecture several times and studied those who listened to him. All this, I imagine, would take several days, as I had a full month left for studying the Tibetan hermits and Respas, which was the final stage of my travels in the country. I decided to sacrifice 2 or 3 days to find out all about the gentle friend and the mountain of simplicity. The teacher started his lecture by directing attention to the utter futility of conscious spiritual guidance. Everyone, he said, must be his own spiritual light and his own guide. Spirituality cannot be given, he said, and stressed the word several times. It was always there. Man had to take it by perfecting himself, and the way to this perfection was reached by introspection, that is to say, by understanding oneself and by discovering the real value of things. The longer he talked, the better I liked him. There seemed to be so much common sense and sincerity about this man. During the lecture, enormous rats seemed to play a kind of football match on the roof of the house. They greatly disturbed the talk by doing so. But the gentle friend and most of his listeners loved animals, all animals, and did not allow anyone to fight or chase rats or any other creature. Non resistance to everything, as I learned a little later, was the keynote of their whole existence, and this non resistance included a passive attitude to animals of any kind. I respectfully disagreed with the gentle friend in this respect. There were obviously two realms of animals in nature. If I was kind to a horse or a dog, and in exceptional cases, even to a bear or a squirrel, the kindness would be justified. But how about kindness to parasites, to snakes, to crocodiles, or sharks? The latter animals belong to a different branch of life. No amount of love, kindness, and non resistance would ever disarm a shark or a louse, I thought. Was it not then a crime to eat, because the food taken by the gentle friend in our circle could have fed many more rats? Surely many of them were hungry, for rats and other parasite animals always multiply a little faster than the food supply available for them could justify, so that they always need more food. Life is a struggle. In the struggle, a just and equitable balance can be kept between man and animals of the non parasite type, but the animals belonging to the descending branch of life, such as gnats, mosquitoes, rats, mice, flies, must be fought. I wondered whether the gentle friend would also object to disinfection during epidemics, out of kindness to germs of disease, if he happened to come to the West. However, apart from this disregard for the elementary fact of polarity in life which led to this absurd kindness to rats, I quite agreed with him as to most of what he said about spiritual matters, and the necessity for man to be independent from visible guidance in spiritual matters. He did not answer any questions after the lecture, but there was a considerable discussion amongst the members of the circle after he had left the room. The teacher gave a second lecture in the afternoon. He began by taking a strong stand against asceticism and zengnaz, fasting to obtain spiritual results. I again heartily agreed with him. He then took up the subject of magic and said it was not only a kuntag, spiritual error, but a veritable crime. The only way to salvation, he went on, was through the disappearance of git mug, ignorance and stupidity. Man must discard his separate spiritual existence, observed the gentle friend with great vigor. And this result is reached by introspection, that is to say, by giving up what I consider the most divine thing in man, his will. The idea struck me that to try to be like God by entirely destroying one's consciousness amounts to committing spiritual suicide. Annihilation could not be the supreme goal of life. Just as in material things, as much egotism is justified as is absolutely necessary to maintain our separate existence. It is the duty of the creature to maintain its individuality, also in the realm of spirituality. Otherwise, life would have no meaning. I profoundly disagreed with the gentle friend in this respect, although most of the things he had said in the earlier part of his lecture had been perfectly acceptable. He then went on discussing I consciousness, group consciousness, and divine consciousness, in which all separate consciousness was absent. He said that in prehistoric times man was not yet individualized. Man then identified himself with the clan to which he happened to belong. Today, man has reached the stage of individual consciousness, and the next step for him was to go from individual consciousness to divine consciousness. I again could not help disagreeing. How could critically minded people swallow such an idea? Prehistoric man was group conscious. Modern man is not yet fully I conscious. Again and again he is drawn back into the clan and family spirit. That is to say, he is alternatingly group conscious and I conscious. So the trend of evolution in modern man is from group consciousness towards full I consciousness. And now the gentle friend proposed that man, whose I consciousness is just emerging from group consciousness, should jump back to a state of total consciousness which existed prior to group consciousness. I again thought of the fact that he recommended people to put themselves on a level with the Creator. Once more I realized a short moment of acute spiritual anguish when I realized that this man too served the purpose of the fallen angels, and wondered whether he was a mere tool or whether he himself was conscious of his decidedly destructive mission. How beautiful had been most of these two lectures. There had been so much truth in them, and yet they were only nearly true. The word almost in spiritual matters is an ominous one. The evil one himself is almost God, and in this world almost lies all the dreadful difference. Perhaps the gentle friend did not realize himself what he was doing. This prospect was slight, but it existed. There are cases of this kind in spiritual life. It occasionally happens that sincere people are struck with spiritual blindness and serve the cause of darkness while they honestly believe they serve the cause of light. I returned to my Fyug den and sat down to think over the further spiritual lesson I had received when I had come to realize the real nature of the gentle friend. Late in the evening, I met the young man who had been the first to show me the way to the Kanpa the day before. He asked me how long I was going to stay, and I answered that I should leave the following day. He also had news to tell me that was rather startling. The rumor had circulated in the district that a lllion, a white person, had walked about alone in the disguise of a Tibetan, and that the Zongpan district governor had sent out several detachments of soldiers to comb the districts. If I was the person to whom the attention of the Zongpan had been drawn, and no other Westerner happened to be traveling in the region, this difficulty may have been the deliberate work of someone in the underground city. There I had not made the slightest attempt to hide the fact that I was a Westerner. I had not even dyed my face during the 3 days I had spent in the Valley of Mystery. Now rapid flight was necessary. Fortunately, about 2 days' walk at top speed would suffice to enable me to reach the region inhabited by the hermits, where I would no doubt receive valuable assistance and protection. I contemplated leaving immediately. But as I had announced my intention to stay just before I heard the news that a Westerner was being searched for in the district, I could not suddenly alter my decision without giving rise to suspicion. I felt some concern about the matter, all the more so as I had thrown Narbu's letter away. I stayed in my den all evening, and late in the morning I went over to the house to attend the lecture, intending to leave immediately after the discussion following the talk given by the gentle friend. That day he lectured on nothingness, on becoming like nothing, and the happiness one derived from becoming like nothing. So there we were. What motive did he recommend for seeking a non-egocentrical conception of life? Happiness? The search for happiness? Not a word about the intense suffering of a man who feels one with all the joys and sorrows of the world. All he recommended was an escape from life, nothingness, and subsequent happiness. That is the very height of selfishness. Before he withdrew, I looked at him fully for the last time. There was nothing in his eyes, voice, or bearing that could have provided any clues as to whether he really believed in the destructive things he had said, or whether he was a mere tool. He may have been the latter. In most cases, apostles who are themselves deceived are very dangerous. It is easier to deceive people if the deceiver believes in his own message. I realized how dreadfully clever and adaptable the Evil One is, and in how many different and cleverly disguised ways he carries on his soul snatching activities. There is the appeal of wealth and power, and the snare of excessive care for the needs of the body. Many people sell their souls to get them. Then there is the appeal of spiritual distinctions and paradises. The city of the initiates is a soul-snatching center of this kind, and for people who cannot be caught by either of the two, there are subtle philosophical systems. Decidedly, the Devil's Shop is a well-stocked one. He caters for all possible tastes, and his snares are everywhere. The gentle friend had left the room, and I listened to the discussion that followed. "Is not the search for happiness in itself a selfish thing?" asked one of the hearers. He seemed to have taken up the objection I had mentally raised during the lecture. "Yes," said another one, "it is." "Then there is a contradiction in all this," again observed the other. "We want to be unselfish, and yet we are selfish in wanting to be unselfish." The other one hesitated for a while and then remarked, "But I fear that my soul does not want it. I want happiness, but my soul does not want it." This remark strikingly illustrated the nature of the type of soul-snatching business carried on the mountain of simplicity, and how man's totalitarian consciousness can be split up by introspection, and his soul subtly separated. My determination to do everything in life with my whole being and with intense soul passion became still greater. At top speed I left the mountain where the Pied Piper plays the tune of simplicity to catch souls. I marched 30 miles that day, hardly stopping to take food. When I sat down to take my lunch, which consisted of a handful of uncooked barley meal and a little water, I pulled out a piece of paper and wrote down the following sketch. The Clever Philosophers. Once upon a time there were clever philosophers. They did not believe in the Creator. "We follow our own light," they said, and in all matters they only relied on the light of introspection. Then they came across the devil. "What a monster," said one of them. "What a comfort to know that nothing is real and everything is a mere reflect of ourselves." "You are right," put in a second philosopher. "Everything is subjective, nothing is objective." Then the devil opened his mouth and swallowed them. When they arrived inside the devil's body, the clever philosopher said with a superior smile, "Is it not obvious that we were right? The monster has disappeared." When I had returned from Asia I found this piece of paper, which had passed through the hands of several brigands, and the inevitable soaking by rain and occasional spills. The sketch is an accurate picture of the mental condition of the circle of listeners on the mountain of simplicity. They seem to ignore the polarity of good and evil.
The same afternoon I saw one of the two flying llamas. The llamas are called Lungompas, which literally translated means air meditation people or wind meditation people, whom I have described in my earlier book. Just after sunset, I passed a place obviously used for cutting up corpses, which is the usual method of disposing of the dead in Tibet. The relatives hand the body over to the Lagpas, the hands or corpse cutters, and the latter carry them to a place usually marked by white stone slabs where the flesh is cut off and thrown to birds who gather for this strange meal when they see the log paws approach in the distance. Sometimes the relatives accompany the funeral procession, but in many cases they do not do so, and the corpse cutters, who are often accompanied by a lama, are left to do their work unaccompanied by the relatives of the deceased. These places used for corpse cutting are a favorite spot for the sorceries and conjurations of the Tibetan tantrikas and nagpas, black magicians. As I was in a great hurry, I did not want to lose time in going round the place in a wide circle. A few magicians were seated there and performed their strange rites with human bones from corpses whose flesh had been cut off recently. One of the sorcerers beckoned to me to keep far away, but since I had heard on the mountain that the district was being combed to find a white intruder, I was anxious to get to the abodes of the hermits as rapidly as possible, and in spite of his energetic signs, I passed the place at a distance of only about 50 yards. The magicians seemed to resent very greatly that I had disturbed the conjurations for which they had specially chosen the time of the day soon after sunset. They interrupted their sorceries and approached in a threatening attitude, one of them actually swinging a ka twamya, a tantric staff with not less than three human skulls fixed at the top. By that time I had met the most sinister forces of Tibet and perhaps the whole world, so I did not feel uncomfortable at all when I saw all these magicians approach in a threatening manner. When they were quite near, I saw that they were almost furious and looked like so many dogs disturbed while taking their meal. The tantrikas almost snarled. They were what a Tibetan would call hani honi, extremely furious. I was not afraid of them. I knew that black magicians were not nearly so dreadful as the gray ones, that is, those who gave themselves the outer appearance of angels and saviors. They surrounded me, each of them blowing a strong breath right into my face. May the Creator punish you for that, I thought, and remained standing motionless, merely concentrating all my soul power so as to counteract any possible tendency at disassociation of my personality. Suddenly, one of the black magicians shouted in an agonized voice, Chom Dinda, the Conqueror, and they all took to their heels. They all ran away in wild terror and disappeared from sight as if a sudden apparition had emerged behind me, inspiring them with great fear. One of the blacks even left his ka twamya behind. Since these sticks are rather bulky and prevent fast running, I could never really find out why these tantrikas had taken to flight so suddenly. I am not aware of having done anything to inspire them with such terror. Night had fallen, but I decided to walk on in the dark. Although the countryside was very mountainous, and I fully realized the risk of doing so, I had to consider the alternative of capture if these reports about the district governor having heard of the presence of a white man were true. So I had the choice between two dangers of a different type, and decided to take my chances on one of both. I should have done better to wait until daybreak instead of walking on in the dark night in the mountainous district, which, as I found a little later, was a very foolish thing to do. I had not the faintest idea that I still had to pass through one of the most dreadful ordeals of my whole Tibetan journey before I reached my goal. The region inhabited by most of the wise hermits who stand for the Creator and isolate themselves in these districts not in order to get selfish bliss, but in a spirit of sacrifice to counteract, in some measure, the dreadful physical currents set loose by the various saviors and the host of fallen angels incarnated in the flesh in Tibet. There may be a few such people even in Western countries, veritable guardian angels of humanity, sometimes incarnated in heroes, who counteract the pernicious workings of certain saviors. But no spiritual being has a right to tell people who is a hero and who is the mouthpiece of fallen angels. Each one must discover this for himself. The moon had not yet risen, but the starlit skies showed the way and provided a very dim light, enabling me to avoid the worst precipices. How different had been the mildly undulating landscape in northern Tibet, when Kishu Karu, the brigand boy, and I had been hunted by the robbers. As I had no blanket, I intended to walk on until sunrise and to sleep then until noon. Soon after midnight, while I was walking on a gentle slope, it seemed as if the whole ground on which I was moving began to give way in the darkness. A few seconds later, I was swept down into the abyss. A portion of my equipment, including the bag containing most of my food, was torn away, while I somersaulted in tremendous bumps down the precipice. Having covered about 200 yards in this manner, the few seconds seeming to be as long as whole ages, I felt that the ground sloped less and less, and finally I came to a standstill. I was unable to move. Half of my clothes had been torn away while I had somersaulted across debris, and perhaps the eighth part of my skin had been lacerated while I progressed in this manner. I thought something had happened to my spine as I was unable to move my trunk. I also felt dreadful pain in my left foot. In this condition I lay on the ground with practically all my food lost, and the night getting colder and colder. I knew I was 25 miles from the nearest human abode, and now had ample time to meditate on the risks of a solitary explorer who makes the mistake of walking in the mountains by night in uninhabited territories. For 2 days and 2 nights I lay paralyzed on the same spot, exposed to the scorching rays of the sun in the afternoon, and to the bitter cold by night. I went through all the agonies of cold, thirst, and helplessness, of a kind that seem unendurable. I realized that even courage, when it is carried to the point of foolhardiness, may be a sin, that it is not enough to avoid sinning against the Creator and against our neighbor, but that man also has obligations towards himself. Never before had I felt with such bitter intensity that there was also such a thing as sinning against oneself. But during those dreadful 2 days, while I lie helpless in the mountains exposed to all kinds of material sufferings and mental agonies, I never blamed the Creator. Thy will be done, I murmured. I had committed a sin against myself by exposing myself to danger without absolute necessity, and fully realized that I deserved the punishment. As I lay there forlorn and helpless, with gushing wounds, I felt that my fate was enviable in comparison with those who had given their souls to the evil one. In all my self caused misery, I was still a child of the Creator. In all my agony, I never uttered the prayer of, "My God, take my sufferings away." I felt that laws of the universe were just, and that I could not importune the Creator with selfish prayers. I had caused my own dreadful predicament, and as a man I had to face the consequences of my blunder. I, the tiny creature, could not ask the Creator to violate the order of His universe and to modify His wise laws of absolutely just retribution in order to please me and take away from me the punishment I had so well deserved. After all, who was I, and who was the Creator? When I contemplated His majesty, I felt the distance which separated Him from His creatures. How can the creature fathom God? It would be like a butterfly trying to fathom the greatness of Shakespeare. The third day I found with great joy that I could move a little. The flesh wounds were healing rapidly, and in spite of the dreadful thirst, partly due to the loss of blood, I began to feel stronger. A little later, I found that my foot was on the mend. The fourth day, I was strong enough to crawl. I still felt much pain in my left foot and could not stand upright, but I crawled along as fast as I could, resting most of my weight on my hands. The first hour I had covered 200 yards. The following hour, the speed had increased to 250 yards. It was not much in comparison with the 20-odd miles still separating me from the abodes of the hermits, but it was better than nothing. I blessed the Creator for having spared me the worst. I might have also injured my hands in the accident, and fell asleep in an exhausted condition. Instead of wasting my strength by continually rubbing my body, as I had done the previous nights, when I was unable to move in the bitter cold, I spent the fifth night crawling along at the rate of perhaps 600 yards an hour. With iron willpower, I kept it up practically all night, and then almost collapsed at daybreak. At noon, I was on my way again, and in the afternoon, I partly regained the use of my legs. The speed at which I now progressed seemed to me enormous. I covered nearly 1.5 miles per hour, and in the evening I shouted repeatedly. The sound of my voice loudly echoed back from the mountains. Every 5 or 10 minutes I shouted. In the great quiet of the atmosphere of Tibet, sound waves travel a long way, and I hoped that some of the hermits might hear me. The following day I advanced at a speed of nearly 2 miles an hour. Two hermits heard the faint sound of a human voice. When they found me, I had almost reached the limits of human resistance to cold, exposure, thirst, hunger, and fatigue. I had lost blood too, but I felt that with an iron will I might have carried on the struggle for another 24 hours before I definitely collapsed. The hermits, who were no soul snatchers this time, but strong and powerful individuals who were intensely personal and yet acted impersonally, took great care of me. They healed my wounds with almost miraculous rapidity, gave me new clothes, and a day later even recovered the sheepskin containing my rubber boat and a few other items of my equipment which had fallen over the precipice. They immediately put me on a special diet which seemed to be very strange to their patients, since it chiefly consisted of a kind of salad made of various medicinal plants and garlic. Ever since I had left the underground city, a strange cadaveric smell had clung to me. The hermits noticed the smell, which they said may have been due to magical operations by which a portion of the vitalizing principle of my physical body had been drawn away by black sorcerers and then decomposed by magical practices for the purpose of killing me. They said that since their practices had not succeeded in murdering me, my enemies had probably killed themselves in the effort. In the hands of those marvelous healers, I recovered with extraordinary rapidity, and the third day after my arrival in the district, I entered the abode of the boarder of my friend who had procured me the Tibetan clothes before I had entered the country. "You have gone through dreadful experiences," he said immediately after having greeted me, "but had we warned you, you might have missed the greatest experience of your life." So he knew all about it. Must everyone discover spiritual values by passing through spiritual ordeals? I asked. Yes, he replied. This is inevitable, for man shapes his own destiny. Of course, the nature of the experiences varies in each case. I have become intensely soul conscious now, I said, and intensely I conscious. I hope you will not turn into an egotist, he observed smilingly. No, I said, an unreasonable high dose of egotism really denotes lack of personality. Animals whose whole energies in life are concentrated on the defense of their I have no personality at all. Full I consciousness is not necessarily brutality and selfishness. Man can be intensely personal and yet act quite impersonally. Although I am very personal now, I shall always work for the world without any thought of a spiritual reward. I intensely realize that the more man approaches full individualization, the more he is conscious of his duties to the Creator, the rising branch of life, and himself. The problem of the world in both an individual and a collective one. Man modifies his environment by living example, and man is in turn influenced by his environment. The multitudes are largely a product of this environment, continually influenced and modified by dynamic personalities. In most cases, strong personalities are the real friends of mankind. rather than those who recommend an absolutely uncompromising attitude leading to a futile attitude of spiritual and material suicide. The province of man is action, and this world of matter, which is really the battleground for a formidable struggle of two different spiritualities, the few wise men of Tibet who are great and dynamic personalities, intensely personal and yet acting impersonally, represent a kind of bodyguard of the Creator which holds in check the other camp of methodically working annihilators and soul snatchers. Can you perform miracles? I asked two other wise men who came to see us the following day. The three hermits smiled meaningly. I could feel their thoughts. They possessed the power to rule over the forces of nature, but their very nature, certain spiritual laws are inherent to the very nature of spiritual beings. Just as a man cannot eat stones or a tree live in a place where sunshine never penetrates, spiritual beings cannot do the spiritual things which are contrary to their spiritual nature prevented them from using those powers unless it was absolutely necessary in the service of the Creator. After a slight pause, one of the wise hermits asked me, the reader will have to realize that the term hermit is a very inadequate one in describing the few genuine Tibetan hermits who are not contemplative but dynamic beings. I have chosen the word hermit because they isolate themselves voluntarily in a spirit of sacrifice. But apart from this, the genuine hermits have none of the characteristics of devotion, contemplative bliss, and meekness which a Westerner is accustomed to associate with the term hermit. Suppose one of us performed a so-called miracle before your eyes. Would you take this as proof of a divine mission? I have seen men flying, I answered, and I have seen the most dreadful types of sorcerers make dead bodies walk. I should take no miracle on earth as a proof of the divine will. The Creator has laid down his own wise laws ruling the universe. It is not he or his servants who break them. When I mentioned the word Creator, they all had tears in their eyes. Did they think of the dreadful spectacle of a world in open revolt against its Maker?